I was sitting in a courtroom I never thought I would ever see from the inside, listening as a judge calmly read my HOA's private emails out loud. Every smug sentence, every careless word, like a dramatic reading, they never expected anyone else to hear. With each email, the room grew quieter, and the HOA president across the aisle grew noticeably more uncomfortable. You could almost hear the confidence draining out of her. What stunned me most was how this all began. Not with construction, not with unpaid dues, but with a single bird feeder hanging from a simple shepherd's hook in my backyard. It was not loud, broken, or visible from the street. It was a small, sentimental gift from my father before he passed away. Somehow, that one harmless object turned into my HOA slapping a lien on my home, the house my family lives in, without so much as a real warning. When the judge finally looked up and asked the board, "Do you stand by these statements?" I knew the tide had turned. But reaching that moment took months of intimidation, threats, legal bluffing, and an HOA president who clearly forgot that emails can be subpoenaed. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I live in a quiet subdivision just outside Maple Ridge, Indiana. The kind of place real estate agents describe as peaceful and family-friendly. The streets curve gently, the lawns are trimmed to near perfection, and every house looks just different enough to pretend there is individuality, even though they all follow the same unspoken formula. My wife Laura and I moved there a little over 7 years ago because we wanted stability. We wanted sidewalks for our kids to ride bikes on, neighbors who waved instead of stared, and a place that felt safe enough to grow old in. At first, the HOA barely registered in my mind. We paid our dues, skimmed the newsletters, and went on with our lives. No drama. No micromanaging. Honestly, it felt boring, and boring was exactly what we wanted. After dealing with noisy rentals and unpredictable landlords in the past, a quiet HOA felt like a small price to pay for peace. The bird feeder did not come with us when we moved in. It came later after my dad passed away. He had always loved birds, especially cardinals. He used to sit on his back porch every morning with a cup of coffee, pointing them out like they were old friends stopping by to say hello. When he died, there were not many personal items I wanted. But that bird feeder mattered. It felt like a small way to keep a piece of him around. I hung it in the backyard, on a simple shepherd's hook near the fence line. You could not see it from the street. It did not make noise. It did not block anyone's view. It was just there, quiet, harmless, and meaningful. For months, nothing happened. Birds came and went. Life moved on. Then one afternoon, I opened the mailbox and found a letter from the HOA. Not a warning. Not a friendly reminder. A fine. $100 for something labeled unauthorized lawn ornamentation. I actually laughed out loud standing in the driveway. I assumed it had to be a mistake. Maybe they mixed up addresses. Maybe someone misunderstood what they were looking at. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I sent a polite email to the HOA manager, Denise Walker. I explained that the bird feeder was in the backyard, that it was not visible from the street, and that it had sentimental value. I asked, calmly and respectfully, which specific rule it violated so I could understand the issue. Her reply came the next morning. It was short, cold, and copied to the entire HOA board. Denise stated that bird feeders were considered visual nuisances and needed to be removed immediately. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of what I had said, no sympathy, just a directive. I replied again, still polite, asking for the exact rule citation. I even attached a copy of the bylaws and mentioned that I could not find anything related to bird feeders or backyard decor. That email went unanswered. Days passed. Then weeks. I assumed silence meant someone realized the mistake and quietly fixed it. Instead, 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, the fine had doubled. $200. Same vague violation. Same cold tone. That was the moment confusion turned into frustration. I was not ignoring them. I was actively trying to resolve the issue. Yet every attempt at communication was met with either silence or escalation. Laura started asking questions. She worried about what would happen if this kept going. I told her it would sort itself out, that no reasonable organization would push this far over something so minor. Looking back, that was my first mistake. I assumed reason mattered. I assumed logic would win. I assumed the HOA was interested in fairness. Instead, what I did not realize yet was that this bird feeder had already put a target on my back. I decided that if this was going to be handled, I was going to handle it the right way. No yelling, no angry emails, no passive-aggressive notes taped to doors. I marked the date of the next HOA meeting on the calendar and prepared like I was going into a job interview. I printed out the bylaws, made notes in the margins, and highlighted every section that had anything to do with yards, decorations, or exterior rules. I wanted facts, not feelings. The meeting was held in the small clubhouse at the edge of the subdivision. Folding chairs, a long table at the front, a cheap American flag in the corner. About a dozen homeowners showed up, most of them retirees who looked more annoyed at being there than interested in what was being discussed. I waited until the open comment portion and stood up with my papers in hand. I explained the situation calmly. I talked about the bird feeder, where it was located, and how it was not visible from the street. Then I referenced the bylaws, pointing out that there was no rule prohibiting bird feeders or backyard decor of that kind. I even said that if I had missed something, I was open to being corrected. That was when I met Carol Hensley. She was sitting in the center seat, perfectly straight, hands folded, wearing a tight smile that never changed, no matter who spoke. When she looked at me, it felt less like being listened to and more like being assessed. Her smile widened just a little as she responded. She said the rules were interpreted by the board and that compliance was not optional. Her tone was polite on the surface but sharp underneath, like she was talking to a child who needed reminding who was in charge. I asked her directly which rule applied. She did not answer the question. Instead, she repeated that the board had authority to determine what fit the community aesthetic. I pointed out, again, that the feeder was not visible from the street. She shrugged and said visibility was subjective. Trying to keep things civil, I offered a compromise. I said I would move the feeder farther back in the yard, closer to the fence, even though it already could not be seen. Carol did not hesitate. She said no. I asked why. She leaned slightly forward and said, "Because we said so." There was a quiet murmur in the room after that. A few people shifted in their chairs. Someone coughed. I felt my face get warm, not from embarrassment, but from disbelief. That was it. No explanation. No rule. No discussion. Just authority for the sake of authority. The meeting moved on like nothing had happened. Budget updates, landscaping contracts, holiday decorations. I sat back down, papers still in my hands, realizing that this was never about a bird feeder. It was about control. After that night, everything escalated. The letters stopped coming by regular mail and started arriving certified. Thick envelopes. Formal language. Red ink stamps warning about non-compliance. The fines increased again. Each letter sounded more threatening than the last, mentioning legal action and enforcement procedures without ever clearly explaining what rule I had broken. Laura noticed the change immediately. She would ask if the mail had come yet, and I could see the tension in her shoulders when I said yes. She started waking up in the middle of the night, worrying about worst-case scenarios. Our kids overheard conversations they should never have had to hear, whispers about fines, lawyers, and whether we were in trouble. I tried reassuring everyone, including myself, that this could not possibly go any further. No sane organization would threaten a family over a backyard bird feeder. But deep down, I could feel the pressure building. Every letter felt like a reminder that the HOA had power and they wanted me to know it. Then one afternoon, I opened the mailbox and saw an envelope that looked different from the others. Heavier. More official. Inside was a notice of intent to lien. I read it twice before it really sank in. They were threatening to put a lien on our home, our actual house, if the fines were not paid. Over a bird feeder. I stood there in the driveway for a long time, holding that paper, listening to kids playing somewhere down the street and a lawnmower humming in the distance. Everything looked normal, peaceful. But in my hands was proof that the HOA was willing to take this as far as it could go. That was the moment fear replaced frustration. And it was also the moment I realized that playing nice was no longer going to be enough. The lien notice changed everything. Up until that moment, I had still been telling myself this was some kind of misunderstanding that would eventually resolve itself. That illusion disappeared the second I realized they were willing to threaten our home. This was no longer about appearances or community standards. This was about control, plain and simple. That night, Laura and I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids went to bed. The lien notice sat between us like something toxic. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, she asked the question I had been avoiding. What happens if they actually do this? I did not have a good answer, and that scared me more than anything else. The next morning, I called a local real estate attorney named Mark Ellison. I went into that call expecting a lecture. I figured he would tell me to pay the fines, remove the feeder, and chalk it up as an expensive lesson. I was already bracing myself to hear that fighting back would only make things worse. Mark asked me to email him everything. Every letter, every notice, every email exchange with the HOA. I sent over a thick folder of documents and waited. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang. He did not speak right away. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that makes your stomach tighten. Then he said slowly, "They skipped several required steps. And this email trail is interesting." That was the first time anyone had said something that sounded like hope. Mark explained that under Indiana law, an HOA cannot just jump straight to placing a lien. There are mandatory notices, waiting periods, and opportunities for the homeowner to dispute the violation. As he walked me through the timeline, it became painfully clear that the HOA had ignored almost all of it. Notices were missing. Deadlines were skipped. Some letters contradicted others. It was sloppy. But the real turning point came when he started talking about the emails. Mark told me that in disputes like this, internal HOA communications can be requested if legal action is threatened. And based on the language in their letters, that threshold had already been crossed. He had reviewed the emails I had sent and the responses I received, but he suspected there was more happening behind the scenes. A few days later, after filing a formal records request, Mark called me again. His tone was different this time. Sharper. Carol had been emailing Denise regularly about me. Not about the rule, not about the feeder itself. About me as a person. In one message, she referred to me as non-compliant and stubborn. In another, she said they needed to make an example out of me so other homeowners would not get ideas. Reading those words felt like a punch to the chest. This was not about maintaining standards. This was about intimidation. They wanted to scare the neighborhood into silence, and I had been chosen as the lesson. There were more emails. Discussions about escalating fines faster than usual. Comments about how most homeowners fold once it gets uncomfortable. One message even joked about how few people actually challenge liens because they assume the HOA must be right. I remember sitting on the couch after Mark forwarded those emails, just staring at my phone. I felt angry, yes, but also strangely calm. For the first time since this started, everything made sense. Their behavior was not random. It was calculated. Mark told me something that surprised me. He said, "Do not respond to them anymore." I asked if that was risky. He said no. In fact, it was the opposite. Every new email they sent without proper legal footing only made their position weaker. He wanted them talking. He wanted them documenting their own overreach. Let them keep going, he said. Let them dig deeper. So I stopped replying. No explanations, no defenses, no emotional responses. The silence clearly bothered them. The emails from Denise became more frequent. The tone shifted from confident to irritated. Carol chimed in more often, pushing for faster enforcement. Each message added another thread to the paper trail. At home, Laura noticed the change in me. I was still stressed, but it was different now. Focused, purposeful. I explained what Mark had found, and for the first time in weeks, I saw some of the fear leave her eyes. We were not powerless anymore. We were not guessing. We had proof. We had proof. The HOA thought they were tightening the noose. What they did not realize was that every move they made was actually handing us exactly what we needed. Once I stopped replying, the HOA escalated faster than I ever imagined. The silence clearly irritated them. Where my emails had once been met with short, dismissive responses, my lack of response now seemed to trigger something closer to panic, or maybe anger. They assumed I had backed down. They assumed I was scared, and they decided to press harder. The fines began stacking up rapidly. What started as a few $100s ballooned into several thousand in a matter of weeks. Each new letter arrived with more dramatic language than the last, warning about enforcement actions and serious consequences. It felt intentional, like they were trying to overwhelm me into giving up. Then came the final escalation. Without waiting for any meaningful resolution, the HOA officially recorded the lien against our home. Seeing that recorded document felt unreal. Our house, the place where our kids learned to ride bikes, where we hosted birthdays and holidays, now had a legal mark against it because of a bird feeder. Laura tried to stay calm, but I could see how deeply it shook her. The word lien carries weight. It sounds permanent, dangerous, like something that should only happen in extreme situations, not petty disputes driven by ego. What the HOA did not know was that Mark had been working quietly in the background the entire time. Before the lien was even recorded, he had already filed a formal request for records. Not just the letters sent to me, but everything. Every internal email. Every message exchanged between board members and management. Every note related to my address. And the HOA complied. They did not question it. They did not slow down. They simply handed over a digital folder filled with their own words, clearly assuming nothing inside could hurt them. When Mark first told me the records had arrived, I expected a few bland emails and maybe some procedural chatter. What we found instead was far worse than either of us anticipated. Carol's emails were the most shocking. They were not professional. They were not careful. And they were definitely not written with the expectation that a judge might one day read them. She mocked homeowners openly, complaining about people who thought the rules did not apply to them. She bragged about how easy it was to pressure people once fines started adding up. One email in particular still sticks with me. In it, she wrote that enforcement worked best on people who looked weak, and that pushing hard early usually stopped others from questioning the board. Reading that made my hands shake. Not just from anger, but from the realization that this was a pattern. I was not the first person they had done this to. I was just the one who did not fold fast enough. Then there was the email that changed everything. In a back and forth with Denise, Carol openly admitted that there was no specific rule against bird feeders. She wrote that enforcement was not about the rule itself, but about maintaining authority. Those were her exact words. Authority, not compliance. Not aesthetics. Control. Mark called me as soon as he saw that message. He did not waste time sugarcoating it. He said this email alone undermined their entire case. An HOA cannot invent violations simply to prove a point. And they definitely cannot admit to doing so in writing. As we went through the rest of the emails, the picture became painfully clear. The board discussed escalating my fines faster than usual. They talked about using the lien as leverage. They assumed I would panic once it was recorded and immediately pay whatever they demanded. At no point did anyone express concern about whether they were acting within the law. Sitting there, reading those messages, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was furious, of course, but I also felt validated. All the confusion, all the frustration, all the nights Laura and I spent worrying, it finally had an explanation. This was never a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Mark asked me if I wanted to settle. He said we could likely get the lien removed quietly if I agreed to certain terms. A few weeks earlier, I might have taken that offer just to make it stop. But after reading those emails, something in me shifted. This was bigger than me, bigger than a bird feeder. If we settled quietly, nothing would change. Carol would move on to the next homeowner. The same tactics would keep working. So I told Mark, no. We were not settling. We were not backing down. We were taking this to court. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt steady. The HOA thought they had crushed me. In reality, they had handed us the very proof we needed to expose exactly who they were and how they operated. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No dramatic wooden benches or echoing chambers like you see on television. Just a quiet room with worn carpet, a few rows of seating, and a single judge's bench at the front. Still, the tension in the air was unmistakable. It felt heavy, like everyone in the room knew something important was about to happen. Carol sat at the defense table with two other board members, both of whom looked nothing like the confident figures I had seen at HOA meetings. One stared down at the table, flipping a pen over and over in his fingers. The other kept shifting in his chair, glancing nervously toward the judge. Their attorney sat beside them, shoulders slumped, eyes tired. He looked like a man who had already lost the argument but still had to stand up and make it. Laura sat next to me in the gallery, her hand wrapped tightly around mine. I could feel her thumb moving back and forth, the way it always did when she was anxious. When the judge entered, the room went silent. The HOA's attorney went first. He argued that the lien was justified under what he called general aesthetic authority. He said the board had broad discretion to determine what fit the community's appearance and that homeowners were required to comply with those determinations. He spoke confidently, but the words felt hollow, like they had been used too many times without being questioned. When it was Mark's turn, he stood calmly and thanked the judge. His voice was steady. He did not raise it or add unnecessary emotion. Instead, he began walking through the timeline. Eights, notices, deadlines that were never honored, requirements under Indiana law that were simply ignored. With each point, he handed the judge a document, clearly labeled and neatly organized. Then he addressed the idea of general aesthetic authority. He pointed out that authority does not mean unlimited power. It does not allow a board to invent violations or bypass legal procedures. He showed the judge the bylaws, highlighting the complete absence of any rule regarding bird feeders or backyard decor of that nature. The judge nodded slowly as he reviewed the papers. That was when Mark introduced the emails. He explained that internal communications had been obtained through a lawful records request and that they directly contradicted the HOA's claims. He passed a folder to the clerk, who delivered it to the judge. The room felt even quieter as the judge began reading. After a few moments, the judge looked up and asked a simple question. "Are these emails authentic?" Carol straightened in her chair. She hesitated just long enough to be noticeable. Then she said yes. That single word changed everything. The judge's expression shifted. He stopped skimming and started reading more carefully. He read lines under his breath at first, then paused, clearly focused. Carol's attorney leaned in, trying to see what page the judge was on. One of the board members swallowed hard. Mark remained still, hands folded in front of him. He did not need to say anything else. The evidence was doing the talking now. The judge looked up again, this time fixing his gaze directly on Carol. He asked her to explain the emails discussing making an example out of a homeowner. She tried to respond, stumbling through a justification about enforcement consistency. The judge did not interrupt. He just listened. Then he turned back to the emails. I watched as the confidence drained from Carol's face. The power she had wielded so casually in meetings and emails was gone. In that courtroom, titles did not matter. Authority did not matter. Only the facts did. As the judge continued reading, it became clear that this case was no longer about a bird feeder or even a lien. It was about abuse of power. And the people who had relied on intimidation and silence were now being confronted with their own words, spoken aloud in a room where they could no longer control the narrative. That was the moment everything shifted. The judge began reading the emails out loud. Not quickly, not casually. Slowly and clearly, as if he wanted every word to land exactly where it belonged. Each sentence echoed through the quiet courtroom, stripped of tone and excuses, leaving nothing but intent. What once felt like private conversations were now public record, impossible to spin or soften. The first few emails drew subtle reactions. A raised eyebrow from the judge. A shift in Carol's posture. The quiet scrape of a chair as one of the board members adjusted uncomfortably. The judge read through discussions about fines, enforcement, and non-compliant homeowners, his voice steady and unchanging. Then he reached the line about forcing compliance through fear. The room went completely still. No coughs. No movement. Even the faint hum of the air system seemed louder than before. Carol's face flushed a deep red, creeping up from her neck to her cheeks. One of the board members dropped his gaze and buried his face in his hands, elbows resting on the table as if he could physically hide from the words being spoken. The judge paused. He looked up from the page and scanned the room, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the weight of it undeniable. Then he continued reading. Emails about targeting homeowners who pushed back. Comments about escalating fines faster than normal. Casual remarks about how most people would panic once a lien was mentioned. I felt Laura squeeze my hand so tightly it almost hurt, not out of fear this time, but out of relief. The truth was finally being said out loud, in a place where it mattered. When the judge finished, he closed the folder and set it aside. He did not deliberate. He did not ask for further arguments. His tone was firm, final. He ruled that the lien placed on my home was invalid and unenforceable. He stated clearly that the fines were unlawful, imposed without proper authority or adherence to required legal procedures. He ordered the HOA to immediately remove the lien and refund every dollar collected. Then he went further. The HOA was ordered to pay my legal fees in full. Not a portion, not a compromise. All of it. The judge also ordered the board to issue a written apology to every homeowner in the community, acknowledging the improper enforcement actions and misuse of authority. I saw Carol's attorney close his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. The board members stared straight ahead, faces pale and rigid. Carol remained perfectly still, hands clenched in her lap, jaw tight. She never once looked in my direction. But the judge was not finished. He stated that based on the contents of the emails and the pattern of behavior demonstrated, he was referring the matter to the state for potential board misconduct review. His words were careful, measured, but the implication was clear. This went beyond a civil dispute. As he banged the gavel and declared the matter concluded, I felt something inside me finally release. Months of stress, anger, and uncertainty collapsed into a single overwhelming wave of relief. Carol gathered her papers without a word. She stood up, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room, and walked out with her attorney. She did not look at me once, and in that moment, I realized the power she once held over my family was gone. undone by her own words, spoken out loud for everyone to hear. The fallout began almost immediately. Word travels fast in a neighborhood, especially when something that dramatic happens. Within weeks of the ruling, changes started rippling through the HOA like cracks spreading across glass. Carol resigned first. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a brief email stating she was stepping down effective immediately. It felt fitting that after months of control and intimidation, her exit was quiet and unceremonious. Not long after that, Denise was fired. The management company released a short statement about failure to uphold professional standards, which was the closest thing to accountability I had seen from them. 2 other board members stepped down shortly after, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew what that really meant. The old guard was gone. In the months that followed, the HOA began to change in ways I never thought I would see. A temporary board was formed, and for the first time, homeowners were invited to participate instead of being talked at. Meetings were held in the evening so working families could attend. Agendas were shared ahead of time. Questions were actually answered. The bylaws were rewritten with homeowner input, not quietly behind closed doors, but openly, line by line. Fines were capped to prevent them from spiraling out of control. Clear procedures were added for notices, disputes, and appeals. Most importantly, vague language that allowed for interpretation without limits was removed. Transparency rules were added, requiring documented justification for enforcement actions and open access to records. Watching those changes happen was surreal. For so long, the HOA had felt untouchable. Now it was accountable. At home, life slowly returned to normal. The lien was officially removed from our property records. The refund and legal fee payment arrived exactly on time, accompanied by a stiff, carefully worded apology letter addressed to the entire community. Reading it felt strange, but it also felt necessary. My bird feeder never moved. It still hangs in the backyard, right where my dad would have liked it. Every morning, cardinals still visit, hopping from the fence to the feeder like they always have. That small, simple routine became a quiet reminder that some things are worth standing up for, no matter how small they seem to others. Neighbors I barely knew started stopping by when they saw me outside. Some thanked me quietly, almost nervously. Others were more open, sharing their own stories of fines they never questioned or rules they were too afraid to challenge. One neighbor, an older man who had lived there longer than anyone else on our street, shook my hand and said, "You did what we were all afraid to do." That comment stayed with me. It meant more than the court victory, more than the money, more than seeing the HOA leadership change. It meant that speaking up had mattered beyond my own situation. It gave people permission to stop accepting unfair treatment as normal. Laura noticed it too. The tension that had lived in our house for months slowly faded. The kids stopped asking worried questions. The air felt lighter. For the first time since this started, our home felt fully ours again. The HOA still exists, of course. But it is different now. Quieter. More careful. And every time I walk past the clubhouse and see neighbors talking freely at meetings, I know that something important shifted. It all started with a bird feeder, and somehow it ended with a community finding its voice. Looking back now, it still amazes me how something so small turned into something so serious. A bird feeder should never put a family's home at risk. But when power goes unchecked, it has a way of growing quietly, feeding on fear and silence until it becomes something dangerous. What started as a sentimental reminder of my father nearly turned into a legal nightmare because no one had ever told the HOA no before. What I learned through all of this is that many HOAs depend on assumptions. They assume you will not read the rules closely. They assume you will not ask questions. They assume you will get scared the moment official letters and legal language start showing up in your mailbox. And most of all, they assume you will not fight back. But sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to bend. not by yelling, not by breaking rules, but by staying calm, knowing the law, and refusing to be intimidated. Saying no, legally and persistently, can be enough to expose abuse that has been hiding in plain sight for years. If this story leaves you with anything, I hope it is this: your home is worth defending. The memories tied to it matter, and no HOA board member, no matter how confident they sound, is above the law. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?